Hello and welcome to the Everyday Apologist. My name is Tim. A few weeks ago, I got to speak to PhD student Jonathan Mclatchie about some questions on common ancestry, biology, and how they relate to the Bible. So we talked for a long time, so I wanted to split that video up into a couple different videos so that they're not too long. So the rest of this video is going to be the rest of my conversation with Jonathan. The end is the same as the last video where he's giving some resources. I felt that was really important for you to go and check out some of those resources on all sides of the debate. So here we go. Let's pick it up with myself and Jonathan Mclatchie. So what are maybe one or two things that you can try to give simplistically that might be that you see as an issue for common ancestry, or you know, and the idea that as I'm having a conversation with someone, I might say, well, what about this position, or what about this piece of evidence? And I feel like that might cause you to call into question that conclusion of common ancestry. So what would be one or two of those things briefly that you would point to?
Common ancestry as opposed to neo-Darwinism?
Yeah, or opposed to creation.
So you mean an argument against common ancestry as opposed to the efficacy of the mechanism?
Correct, yeah.
Okay. Well, the fact that, for example, often you find cases where you have homologous structures which develop by virtue of fundamentally non-homologous developmental pathways, and so that I think is a challenge to common ancestry. The fact that in invertebrates, embryonic development, embryos start out very differently and then converge at the phylotypic stage and then diverge again. The fact that the modification of early developmental processes, the early developmental processes are the least likely to be perturbed without causing very significant deleterious effects downstream. And so that's, I think, a challenge to common ancestry. I think challenges to neo-Darwinism are far more powerful, such as, for example, there are studies which demonstrate that the prevalence of functional stable protein folds within the combinatorial space, if you will, of amino acids. Amino acids are the subunits that form proteins, and they have to be arranged in a specific way in order to cause the protein to collapse into a three-dimensional structure. And there's 20 different amino acids that are used to make proteins found in life. And if you have, say, an amino acid residue of 150 amino acids, that's 20 to the 150 power of arranging those amino acids. So you have a vast combinatorial space. And then the question is, how many of these possibilities are actually functionally significant, and how many are gibberish? And it seems to me that the evidence indicates quite strongly that the prevalence of functional protein folds within combinatorial space is astronomically small. And so you're effectively searching for a tiny needle in an enormous haystack, and so that's a serious problem. And also when you compound that with the fact that you frequently find irreducibly complex macromolecular machines in living systems, machines which are formed of components, and overall the overall number of components contributes to an overall function. And if one of the subfunctions that's contributed by one of the subcomponents of the molecular machine is missing, then the overall function ceases to exist. And so the question is, how do you build that up by virtue of a neo-Darwinian stepwise type of pathway? And it seems to me that it's very difficult to explain. And there are many other challenges to the neo-Darwinian synthesis as well, but these would be a few challenges that I would bring up. Another issue I could bring up real quickly is the issue of the Cambrian explosion, which is an event in the history of life which occurred approximately 530 million years ago, and within a very narrow window of geological time, you have the abrupt emergence of many of the animal phyla, which are the body plans, if you will. On a neo-Darwinian scenario, you would predict large-scale differences, morphological disparity, if you will, only occurring after numerous small-scale speciation events, whereas the Cambrian explosion really turns that on its head, and you see the large-scale differences morphological disparity preceding the variations on those themes over time. So that's another challenge that I would raise, I think.
Okay. So one of the things that you were saying on that last point about structures needing to have more form or a complete form, or they wouldn't be able to be used. I've heard this idea presented kind of like the mousetrap. So is that something that you would someone that they could take with? So the idea of a mousetrap is if you just have a board, it's not going to catch any mice. So you really need all the components of a mousetrap complete before it can be effective for its job. And therefore we see this happening in species and in animals and in very minute pieces of the cell. Would you agree with that?
Sure, it's an illustration. As all illustrations have its shortcomings, but I think it's an illustration which is good for explaining the concept of irreducible complexity.
Yeah. Okay. Great. If somebody wants more information, Jonathan, about this and maybe educate themselves a little bit more on both sides of the spectrum of this, the Neo-Darwin, the old Earth creation, where would you send them? Where would be a good resource for them to further their education in this subject?
Sure. I think Evolution News and Views is one of the best blog websites that covers this issue. It's evolutionnews.org. And there you can get news updates on peer-reviewed scientific papers that have come out and addressing objections that are being made and reviewing criticisms of the intelligent design arguments. So that's a great resource. I'd also recommend reading several books like Darwin's Doubt, which is a book that came out over a year ago. On the Cambrian explosion, came out about 2 years ago on the Cambrian explosion and the case that makes for intelligent design as well as against Darwinism. I'd also recommend Signature in the Cell by Stephen Meyer as well. And I'd recommend, that's on the origin of life. I'd recommend The Design of Life, which is a sort of a very good introductory level textbook, which is written by William Dembski and Jonathan Wells. You could also read Michael Behe's work, Darwin's Black Box, which is outlining the case from irreducible complexity, and also his more recent, published in 2006, The Edge of Evolution, which is tries to delineate the limitations of the Neo-Darwinian mechanism. I mean, there's many books that could be listed. On the other side, I'd recommend reading Jerry Coyne's Why Evolution is True. Okay. We'll give you sort of an introductory level book on the arguments for evolution. Also Richard Dawkins' The Greatest Show on Earth. Ernst Mayr has a classic book, and the late Ernst Mayr has a classic book called What Evolution Is, which is basically an introductory level book on the mechanism of evolution and what evolutionary biologists study, and it's a great resource if people want to get up to speed on that. So cool. There's a few resources for you.
Great, awesome. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for being on the show. We're looking forward to having you again. We'll talk about a different subject in the future, and make sure you guys check out those resources that Jonathan explained. You can watch this video over and over and over again. I know there was some pretty in-depth concepts that we were talking about, but I think that if you can take just a couple of those pieces that we mentioned and use them in conversation with people that are skeptics or people that bring up the original objection that we talked about, creating this tension between current science and the scriptures and not being able to reconcile those two. You can also use this video to pass it along to someone that may have an interest in this. And if you're out of your depth in an area when you're talking about this, say that you don't know. Don't pretend that you do know. There are people like Jonathan that you can point them to. He's done a number of videos and podcasts that will help explain some of this stuff. And you can help further educate yourself with some of those books that Jonathan mentioned and some of the websites. So that's all for this week. We'll see you again soon. Thanks.